3 myths or misconceptions about the spiritual awakening journey and raising your energetic vibrations. So, I've been on this path for spiritual awakening, this journey of spiritual awakening and ascension for the last year and a half or so. When I started my channel back in 2020, I talked to you guys about all the changes that I've gone through and all of the research I've done, all the reading that I'm continuously doing, all the expansion I'm continuing to do in terms of my own spiritual growth. But I keep finding that there are a lot of myths or misconceptions or mistakes or however you want to word it around this whole spiritual awakening journey and around raising your energetic vibrations. And so I thought that I should come on here and share some of the ones that I'm coming across, but more importantly, share the correct truth. And I hope that my information can be helpful for you today. So stick with me. Myth number 1. So after you experience or you come into the realization that you're experiencing or have experienced a spiritual awakening phase, which usually is inclusive of like being in this bliss state and really being empowered by, a peek into these spiritual gifts. I find that people are saying, or this misconception that people are saying that after that, you usually go back into being lower vibe again, or you could possibly go through this dark night of the soul or anything in that nature. That is not necessarily true. In fact, it's not typically common. If you do this one thing, you become intentional about your spiritual growth while you're still at that higher state of consciousness. Now, of course, if you go back to, you were tracked back into the lower state of consciousness, maybe from fear or overwhelmed, because now that you've had this new awakening and this experience within a higher state of consciousness, you're a bit overwhelmed, or you're like, oh, this is a lot of power, and I thought that my life was one way in this 3D matrix, and I just want to be a normal human again. I don't want to know all this stuff. I don't want to feel these things. I don't want to see these things and know about powers, because I just want to be basic, for lack of a better word. Hope that's not offensive to anyone. But yeah, you don't necessarily go back to being low vibe, and you definitely don't necessarily go through a dark night of the soul, right? That is dependent on your own energetic frequency. That is dependent on your own soul experience. Again, your soul experience isn't indicative of this specific lifetime or this specific human experience or incarnation. And thus, like for people like me, I had already had my dark night of the soul before I had my quote unquote spiritual awakening, because my spiritual awakening is when I came into this level of consciousness about this soul expansion, this expansion of knowingness, where I was sitting in intention. But I had always, grown up a person of faith. I had always dealt with adversity and struggles or whatnot, and always moved through them. And lo and behold, I'd been ascending or having, many awakenings or subconscious awakenings. I've read or heard of them referenced. But when I had my biggie spiritual awakening, because I had already had my dark night of the soul, and I had already had a specific elevated level of consciousness because of my own soul growth, my own soul frequency and evolution through lifetimes prior to this, I didn't go backwards. I was very invested and very intentional. That like, oh, I got magical powers now, and I see things and know things, and I feel like I'm one. I really have appreciation for this oneness and the fact that I don't know everything, because there's multiple truths existing in this one stream of consciousness. And I was excited about that and the possibilities and potentials of continuing to grow in that and ascend. And so I don't want people to be scared of this idea that after it's really, really fun and really good in the beginning, there might be a down point where you fall back down or you revert back to your old ways. In fact, it's actually a lot harder to do that because now that you have this new level of consciousness and you feel this level of bliss, it's almost like, well, why would you want to go backwards? You don't necessarily go backwards, right? Can you even go backwards now that you've seen a glimpse of the other side? And so that's the first misconception that I'm finding. As long as you are intentional, you will not go backwards. I can say that. The next misconception that I want to talk about is spiritual awakening or spiritual ascension not being synonymous with ego death. So spiritual awakenings and or like a kundalini awakening or a spiritual ascension experience is usually a trigger or marker for the beginning or the catalyst for the beginning of what we talk about as ego death, the balancing out and regulation of the ego and superego. In the terms or sense of the ego begins to be less fearful and less pronounced, and you no longer sit in the false ego, which is driven by fear and driven by the past reality, a lower vibrational 3D matrix earth reality that's so fear-based, where you don't know and understand your own superpowers because you haven't actually experienced that higher level of consciousness. So what essentially happens is that because you've had the spiritual awakening or the kundalini awakening or however you want to term it, whatever label you want to place on it, but because you've had that peak into and that up leveling or elevation of higher consciousness, you now relate to and feel more oneness, right? With the people around you, and you have an appreciation for that universal consciousness. And such, when you are in situations that normally would create fear and trigger the ego, because you have a wider awareness and peace and safety in that, right? Comfort and understanding in that, you don't have to be driven by the fears that you had before that were tied to like being out for self and your own separateness or your individuation within this universal stream of consciousness. And thus you don't need to be driven by the ego. Then again, starting this process of what we call ego death, which is again just having a healthy, more balanced ego where it really only needs to poke out if you're in real threatening situations, which is very rare because you're all powerful now. So yeah. And a lot of the times, just to throw out there, when you go through this process of ego death or you start transitioning through it actually assists with, like I said in the first myth, which is like not going backwards. If you start going through ego death, or the ego death process begins right after the awakening, or maybe parallel to your awakening, the likelihood of you falling back into your old unconscious patterns, habits, and lower vibrational tendencies is even more less likely. So that's just something for you to think about. Last but not least, in terms of myths and misconceptions around spiritual awakening and raising your energetic vibration, is the fact that falling into old unconscious behaviors or patterns here and there, not like regularly, actually does not lower your energetic vibration and does not like drop you back into lower consciousness. At least it doesn't right away. So this myth is more associated with the whole energetic vibrations and the myths around that. So in this community and as you research, you'll begin to find and hear people referencing things that you can do or ways or steps you can take to increase or raise your energetic vibrations. But in tandem with that, you have a tendency to find people talking about or research showing what you could do or what by doing will lower your energetic vibrations or take you back down to a lower vibrating, lower consciousness state. So you usually hear that eating particular bad foods or foods that are lower vibrational foods and specific behaviors or interactions and engagements of such within lifestyles or and other things or other natures have the possibility of lowering your vibration. And it really just all starts to sound a little scary or a little weird. They make you think that like every time, you get angry or, lash out or do anything that was of your old unconscious patterns or the older version of yourself, you're now, falling back into a low vibrational state. Now, the reality is this, that as you raise your energetic vibration through intention and consistent shadow work, and integration of self-love, knowing yourself, learning yourself, accepting yourself, and being empowered by that, you will increase and raise your energetic vibration as a whole. And in doing that, you begin integrating, the older version of yourself into the newer version of yourself. But of course, that doesn't happen overnight. Integration doesn't happen overnight. So there should be no fear. You don't need to be fearful or scared of the fact that if you ever find yourself repeating an old unconscious pattern or falling here and there, back into old unconsciousness, as long as you have the awareness, the acute awareness, and you set intentions around every time you do it, moving back out of that as quickly as you can and centering yourself, grounding yourself back into your higher state of consciousness, so that you can go into the integration into the higher state of consciousness, you will not lower your vibration. Raising your energetic vibration and spiritual awakening and really enlightenment is about loving and living in your authentic self. Your authentic self by no means is synonymous to being a pacifist or only being a peacekeeper and being love and light and all of these things all the time, but being authentic to who you are in terms of your own soul growth and your own authentic nature. It means standing up for yourself, having boundaries, loving yourself, and allowing that to energetically express and show up the way it does, as long as it's in alignment with who you are at an authentic place from the heart chakra, from a place of empowerment and not fear, but loving yourself and knowing yourself and allowing that to externally reflect in all of your relationships and in your external reality on a day-to-day basis. If you are doing the work, if you are doing that, you will be raising your energetic vibration at the deepest core state. And the times you slip in and out won't impact you and just bring you back down to low vibes again. It just won't. And it won't be, the food that does it either. If you are intentional about being at a higher state of consciousness and always trying to be the best, newer version of yourself, and trying to always be in that source essence, eating a piece of pizza or eating some cheese or any of the things that they list in terms of lower vibrational foods, it's not going to lower your vibration just because you have a piece of cake. This human experience is completely the opposite of what those myths talk about or that myth talks about. This human experience essentially is about experiencing the best of human life, good food, and the things that bring you joy. It's not about deprivation. It's about balancing, right? Enjoying things within balance and without overindulging and overdoing it. Because when you do that, if you overindulge and move into gluttony, where you're not just enjoying it or experiencing it, but you have some other coping mechanism or low vibrational trauma or lower vibrational expression tied to, you know, you enjoying the human experience things, then of course you're gonna have lower vibes because your vibration is already lower. But I guarantee you, your vibration won't be lower because of the food. It'll be lower because of whatever coping or whatever lower vibration experience you've had, or trauma, or a thing that needs to be healed, because it's creating a lower vibration. It will be manifested or showing up, you know, through eating low vibrational foods and eating too much of it. So I hope that that's been clear and that's been helpful. Again, this whole journey about spiritual awakening and raising your energetic vibration is about being authentic to yourself, being true and loving yourself, and allowing all of that to reflect externally into the world around you and into all of the relationships in your life all around you. I hope that this has been helpful. Stick with me, subscribe, share, like my channel. Stick with this channel, Raising Vibes with Devyn, for more tips, tricks, and myth and misconception debunks, I guess, along this path for spiritual awakening. I encourage you to come back for the next video. I'll see you guys back here next time. Bye.